Prime Minister Tony Blair, welcome to GZERO World.
Thank you, Ian.
So much to talk to you about right now. We're both here in New York. We're talking to a lot of global leaders. But I have to at least start, given the events of the past weeks in your country. You know, after 70 years of Queen Elizabeth, and you knew her so well, tell us something personal, interesting about your relationship with her.
Well, you know, I grew up with the Queen, and when I first met her as Prime Minister, she said to me, "You're my 10th Prime Minister. The first one was Winston Churchill. That was before you were born." So, you know, I realized you were always talking with someone who this vast historical experience. She was very gracious and actually kind, very empathetic towards her prime ministers. She knew the burden of responsibility you carried, and she was conscious of that, and always helpful. I couldn't really tell you what her politics were. She was always above, the politics, but she had this intense commitment to duty. I mean, it really was her driving force, and that those characteristics of sort of dignity, duty, decency, they defined her, and I think they gave her this power of example, if you like, and she was just such a constant feature of British life through all the changes. I mean, if you go back to the 1950s, look at 1950s Britain, just go and watch the films of the coronation and just see the faces. Then you go fast forward to Britain 2022 and the huge difference in social makeup, in class, in society, in the way we live, work, think, everything. And she managed to guide the monarchy through all of that. So she was a remarkable person. We used to meet every week, obviously when I was Prime Minister. And then I was actually with her about 3 months ago. We had lunch together when she bestowed this honor on me called the Knight of the Garter.
I remember that. You have to dress up for that, really.
Well, it was instigated in 1340. And
and it seems like the outfits haven't changed very much.
No, that's right. So you have to, if you want to see a really ridiculous picture of me, you can Google it and see that. But she was ungrateful. She was very reflective, and she had it seems an odd thing to say about a monarch, but she was actually very streetwise. She kept her pulse firmly on where the British people were.
In 2022, for some, the monarchy feels like an anachronism. It is very different from the 50s in lots of ways. I mean, the Labour Party in Australia today is a Republican party. Do you feel like there have to be changes in the monarchy?
Well, I think King Charles will instigate certain changes. I think probably, or so I read. I mean, I don't know, but look, in the end, my generation, which was, as it were, the first generation that grew up in a society really that doesn't have the same deference, didn't have the same attachment to class as traditional British society. We've come to our own settlement in our own minds of this issue, if you like, which is, you can have an elected president or you can have a monarch, and we prefer that, the tradition of the monarch, someone who's above politics. It gives you a certain point of unity as a country, even if your politics is quite divided, which ours has been, like yours in the past few years. And so, we've come to not a kind of, not an historical or a traditional decision to keep the monarchy. We've come to what is a rational decision that we prefer it to the alternative system. And so I think provided, and I'm sure this will happen with King Charles, by the way, because he's a decent and caring guy. I think if the monarchy keeps to this principle of duty to the country first, service to the country first, I think it's reasonably well, supported in British society.
As a unifying factor for the country.
Yeah, as a unifying factor. And, Western politics is pretty ugly and has been for several years. But, with the Queen's passing, I mean, even people I knew who were Republicans were moved by it and respected her and supported her. And I think, Prince Charles, as he was then, was, for example, on issues like the environment, on better relationships between the faiths, was well ahead of his time. the royal family, because of the Commonwealth and the number of African countries within the Commonwealth, they were very, very, it's very ingrained in the monarchy, this head of the Commonwealth, the concept of that. So but who knows? But I think it's, for the moment, I would say the monarchy is pretty safe.
So we also have a new prime minister. It's been a busy couple of weeks for the United Kingdom. She comes into power not only with the transition of your monarch, but also with massive challenges on her plate. I mean, just scandals every day under Boris Johnson, difficulty in terms of preparing for the inflation, particularly on the energy side that we presently see, the continued knock-on effects of Brexit, which she initially voted against, but now is a flag carrier for. I mean, I know that she's not of your party, but you want her to succeed, of course. I mean, how do you think she is? It's almost too early to say how she's doing, but how do you feel about her priorities as she's so far addressed them?
I mean, you've got a short-term challenge, which is the energy price rise, because this is huge, and then you've got a longer-term challenge. On the short-term challenge, the rise in energy costs, it's just important to understand what this means in Britain and across Europe. I mean, household bills will literally treble. Right, you're going to be talking about thousands of pounds more that people will be forced to pay. So the government's going to have to intervene because, frankly, a large part of the population literally won't be able to pay it. And also, if you try and force them to pay it, you'll have a massive negative impact on the economy. Okay. So you've got a short-term issue where government's going to have to subsidize, effectively, energy costs through this winter.
And the announcement that she's made on that front, the £100 billion plus, was that the right approach?
Well, I mean, my institute put out a paper that was more targeted and with what would have been an incentive to use less energy. I think the problem with just a blanket subsidy, I understand the reasons for it this winter, but if this carries on, the problem over time is that you're not giving people an incentive to reduce their energy bills by reducing energy demand. Okay, so, but whatever way you want to cut this particular cake, it's going to cost a lot of money. Okay, so that's the short term. The long term question that she's identified is the right question, which is around growth. And because, when I was prime minister, we had growth rates, well above 2% was the trend rate of growth. We've been growing well under 2%. And you've got to get the growth rates up, because if you don't, one of the first things you realize in government is if growth's strong, revenues are strong. If revenues are strong, you can spend money on public services. If the growth rates are low or you're in recession, then suddenly everything looks worse and you're having to cut back on services. So she's right to target growth. Now, she's going for a particular way to do that, which is a lot of tax cuts and so on. Personally, I think the big questions around growth long-term for Britain are around the technology revolution, infrastructure, and education. So whatever she's doing on tax cuts and so on, for me, the big three things are really those, and it's too early to say whether she has plans for those or not.
You met with Ursula von der Leyen, among others, recently. How is the UK perceived today by the European Union? And I'm not just talking about its leadership, but generally speaking, how is it changing over the last few years since the Brexit referendum?
Well, I think there's a lot of frustration in Europe, in the sense that the European Union didn't want Britain to leave. And people like Ursula von der Leyen are very Anglophile in their outlook, close links with the UK. And so they want to have a good relationship with Britain going forward. Now, we've got to resolve this Northern Ireland Protocol, which is a Brexit hangover, because if you take the United Kingdom as a whole, which means Britain, the island of Britain, and then Northern Ireland, if you take all of it out of the single market of the European Union, the external border of Europe becomes the border between North and South in Ireland. And therefore, in theory, you should put border controls along that border.
Which is deeply unpopular and dysfunctional.
Exactly, and conflicts with the Good Friday Agreement, a part of which was to keep the border open. Okay, so it's a problem which I think we could resolve practically, and my institute again suggested ways we can do that. We need to sort that out, and then we need to look for how we build a more constructive relationship with our own continent. And I think there's a willingness on the European side to do that. And the only question is whether the very kind of anti-European politics of a part of the right in Britain get in the way of that. And it would be tragic if it did, because as I say to people, you can change the political and legal relationship that Britain has with Europe. What you can't do is change our geography. You get from London to Paris quicker by train than you get from London to Scotland.
I want to ask you, given what you've seen of the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, and given what you've seen of her cabinet, do you think that they will be able to avoid playing politics with the Ireland border?
I think and hope that they're sensible enough to just settle the Northern Ireland Protocol issue and move on. I think they will. I hope they will. I mean, we'll see. But if you want a solution to it, there is a practical solution. If it becomes an ideological fight, with Britain effectively saying Europe's got to drop its single market rules and so on to suit us, then the thing won't work. But I feel there are some indications that the new Prime Minister will try and take a pragmatic view.
Now, you say that the Europeans, of course, didn't want the UK to leave the European Union. Of course, it's also true that a lot of Britons didn't want the UK to leave. You were one of them.
Me, absolutely.
The Scots, of course, a large majority didn't want to leave. Northern Ireland, of course, this is a huge challenge for them. Does this make it more likely over time, in your view, that the United Kingdom ultimately disintegrates?
Well, I hope it doesn't, and I think it won't, but it obviously adds a dimension to the case of the people arguing for independence.
What's the biggest tension point that we need to watch going forward?
I think it's that if you're in Scotland and you really, you especially with a younger generation, you want to be part of Europe, and you see particularly a conservative government that you haven't voted for because Scotland's not voting Conservative, being anti-European, it's bound to fuel, and the nationalists are using this. Now, I think the reasons for Scotland remaining tied to the United Kingdom, economic reasons, are massively powerful, and I think in the end they'll outweigh anything else in the end. But it's given an extra dimension. I'm as worried, if not more worried, about Northern Ireland because they're, again, a majority voted to stay in the European Union. Northern Ireland will, in effect, remain to some degree a part of that single market in Europe. And, for the first time very recently, the numbers of Catholics have outweighed the numbers of Protestants in Northern Ireland. Now, not everyone votes on that basis, but there are tensions. So I think and hope the UK stays together, but there's no doubt Brexit has given an impetus to the people arguing for either United Ireland or Scottish independence.
Is there any recognition among the Brexiteers, given what has happened, the trajectory of the UK economy, the tensions, the fact that the US-UK trade deal for the time being is not in the cards, that actually they were selling a bill of goods? Do you get any of that?
Not a lot. I mean, it's...
Look, because you do have a new passport color, for example. I mean, I know that's a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, no, look, we were told there'll be more money for the National Health Service. There's obviously not, because growth rates are down and therefore revenues are down. And we've spent, in any event, billions of pounds on new border checks and all the rest of it. We were told there would be an easy UK-US trade deal. Not merely is it not easy, it's not even under discussion. We were told that it was nonsense to suggest that Northern Ireland was going to become a problem, when it was obviously going to become a problem if we did Brexit in the way that was being described. But look, those of us who are passionately against Brexit, we've got to accept the argument. The argument's over, and what you're going to look at now is how you fix the Brexit problems and move on, is what I would say.
When you were Prime Minister, the world and governance and democracy looked very different, in many ways more stable than it does today. If you were prime minister today, if you were a leader on the global stage, what would you do differently as a consequence of that now than back in the days of cool Britannia?
So I would be doing two things, because I think for the West to be, for me, it's all about the West being strong, able to defend its values and its interests in an era where the geopolitics of the 21st century is going to change dramatically because of China. So my view is, number one, the West has got to be a strong alliance. And if there is any benefit coming out of the ghastly events in Ukraine, it is that alliance has strengthened. And that means America and Europe and then our allies around the world, including in the Pacific, we stick together, we stay together, and we're more effective together. Because the second thing I would say is the biggest challenge to democracy is efficacy. When you follow a lot of the media debate, it's all about transparency or accountability. It's not, it's about effectiveness. And this is where I come to the second thing, which is, in my view, the big real world event is this technology revolution. And if you're looking at healthcare today or education today, or how people are going to work, how government functions, it's all about understanding that revolution. And its transformative potential. And what the West needs is not just a strong foreign policy, it needs a strong domestic mission, right? And that should be about this technology revolution and how you harness it. But to do that, the West politics have got to return to a strong center, because that's what we had when I was in office. And the center, not as the split between left and right, which I think is a 20th century, left-right politics is so 20th century, right? The real issues today are really practical, not ideological. But the center should be the place where you make the changes that match the scale of the challenge.
So I'm telling you, if you were campaigning, I kind of feel 21st century third way is what you're talking about.
Yeah, but this is correct in the end. I mean, what we, this is what I often say to people in the Labour Party when they say to me, Tony, we can't go back to 1997. And I say, no, we can't. But the trouble is, you guys want to go backwards. You want to go pre-1997. I agree. Today, all the things we were talking about then have accelerated. They're not diminished or fallen away. I mean, when Bill Clinton and I were launching the initiative around the human genome, and I always remember him saying to me at the time, I think this is one of the most important things we'll ever do, which turned out to be true. Not that I really understood it fully at the time. But you fast forward to today, it's even more important, right? So this is why I think that the problem is the populism in the West. It succeeds when the center can't solve the problems. And I always say to people, populism doesn't invent grievances. By and large, it doesn't invent them. It exploits them. So if you take immigration, for example, you've got to deal with immigration. If you don't have an immigration policy today, which provides controls over it, even if you're telling people, immigrants do a great job in our economy, but you still need control. If you're not in that space, the populist is going to come along and exploit that issue. So it's all about, in my view, the retrieval of that strong, clear center. And, this is where politics has got to reach out beyond the ranks of professional politicians who spent their whole life doing nothing but politics, and understand the world, embrace it, and then change it.
Prime Minister Tony Blair, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.